How many of the people who get sick with COVID-19 die? That's actually a much more complicated question than first meets the eye. And of course, the answer has changed as we became immunized. It's changed radically with vaccination because it's much more risky to catch SARS-CoV-2 if you have a naive immunity, if you've never seen the vaccine and if you've never been infected before. That is why vaccination is a safer proposition than catching the disease. But how do you count the percentage mortality? There's actually at least two ways to do that, and they are very different from one another. One of them is the case fatality rate. So you look at all the people who get diagnosed and you simply count the ones who die. The problem with that, though, is that the people who get diagnosed, it can be harder or easier to get diagnosed depending on where you live, what stage of pandemic waves you arrive at, etc. So where I live in Switzerland, for example, early on, there was a shortage of tests. And so you couldn't just get a test to get a confirmed diagnosis. You had to meet certain criteria. You needed to be sick enough, basically, so people would test you. And of course, if you only test the sickest people, well, more of those will die than of the ones who have the more benign form. So it looks like the virus is killing more people initially. This also happens when people get tired of testing and just only test if they're very ill. And so you have this situation where vaccination really brought the case fatality rate down because fewer of the people who were diagnosed were dying. But then they stopped testing. So you had fewer people getting diagnosed, and the ones who were only the sickest ones of all. And so the case fatality rate rises again. But it's not because the virus has become more severe. It's just because our diagnostic habits have changed. And that is the case fatality rate. It's very dependent on diagnostic practices. And this means that a better measure is the infection fatality rate. And for this, you need to do population-wide studies. For this, you basically do serological tests. You do repeated serological tests among different groups in the population. And you look at the number of cases and the number of deaths, and you estimate based on the seroprevalence data how many people are actually dying based on the number of infections now. Because now you know the number of infections. Even the undiagnosed infections are going to come up in your study. So this is no longer dependent on diagnostic practices, but it's no longer counting. You're now doing an estimation. And infection fatality rates are typically lower than case fatality rates because you're catching infections that aren't getting diagnosed here. So you have a broader population and you still have the same number of deaths, right? Nobody more is dying depending on how you measure things. So in that case, the percentage is lower. The percentage mortality rate of around 0.7 or 1%, if you round it up, that is an infection fatality rate. It's the lower number. The case fatality rate started out higher than that. Here's the estimate for the country where I live in Switzerland. For good measure, here's the US, to welcome you back on TikTok. Here's the UK, here's New Zealand. You can go check the website yourself at this point. And here's the world. Now, 1% does not sound like much, but it is actually more than meets the eye. You can take a calculator, your phone, and you can do the math. It's very simple math yourself. Imagine if everyone in your country catches this disease without having been vaccinated first, so they are exposed to the initial infection fatality rate, and imagine everybody gets it. That's not exactly what happens, but we're rounding things off and doing an estimate here. So imagine that everybody gets it and 1% die. It's very easy to calculate the number of deaths that this means, and you'll see it's a pretty big number. If you go check out the number of people in your country who actually did die, that number is likely to be substantially lower. And that is the number of lives that got saved by protecting people from infection enough time so that they could get a chance to become vaccinated first. Yeah.